The first question I pose to you all is, can you recall your earliest memory of wanting to be a writer, whatever form that might take? Poetry, memoir, fiction, non-fiction. Actually, this word non-fiction drives me mad. I don't know what it is, why they call things non-fiction. I mean, I'm anyway very confused. What is fiction, what is not fiction? But when did you decide that words were going to be your primary medium of expression? I think we'll begin that way now. Paul.
Thank you. The earliest stories that I was told actually as a child by my mother were Ali Baba and Aladdin. And my mother was an orphan growing up in the north of Brazil. The first book she received from her adopted father was the Arabian Nights. And she remembers the adult sort of version it wasn't a kid's illustrated edition. My parents had lived in the Middle East before I was born, so I have to confess, I hope this is not being taped, but there is footage of me, surrounded by objects from the Middle East, pretending to be Aladdin, and I think that that really was those were the first stories that I was making up, the first sequels and franchises I was dreaming of were in fact Alibaba and Aladdin, which is why many years later, I've been intrigued by the knowledge that these stories didn't have originals in Arabic, and they had a very mysterious origin. So there's a connection to the book.
Hi everybody, thank you all for coming first thing in the morning. It's a pleasure to be here in Boulder. I had the great privilege of growing up in a household that was full of books. My mother is a professor of literature, and my father is a writer as well. So we had lots and lots of books around the house, and for me, I always felt that writing was a helpless kind of activity. That it was something that you did naturally. And so, as from a young age, I would write little stories. We were also, my brother and I, who's a writer himself, and sitting in the back of the room. We were read to, from a really young age, all sorts of stories. My mother was quite deliberately eclectic in the way she raised us. So she would read to us from sort of abridged versions of the Bible, as well as from the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings. And we also had the sort of realms of Enid Blyton and other kinds of children's tales. So we were saturated with all sorts of material. And I remember when on my parents' old blue screen WordPerfect desktop, banging out little short stories about, they were I was, like an 8-year-old boy, so they were invariably a little bit bloody and militaristic. But banging out short stories like that on that old blue screen. And that's, it sounds a little bit trite to say, but that's where it began.
Well, I must tell the audience that Kanish's father was a friend of mine. I was and around the same age, and so when he was 12, he wrote his first novel, which was published in the Junior Statesman. And it was also quite bloody and military. It was a World War II kind of novel, if I remember. What about
Diplomacy has won since.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, likewise, I remember trying to write stories at about 7, different generations on my mother's IBM Selectric. At the same time, so I knew then that I wanted to try writing, and mine were more about purple fog engulfing nations, and I guess I was probably influenced also by Purple Haze. But it actually didn't seem very possible in my background to become a writer. I was in Section 8 housing on food stamps, and I couldn't figure out how that would work. And I didn't know that there were living poets either, so I thought I would be a fiction writer. It wasn't until I was hitchhiking around Greece and I picked up a book of modern Greek poets, which happened to have poems by my great-grandfather in them, and that was sort of an awakening that poetry was a possibility. And I realized I just didn't have a narrative mind. I did not have a normal narrative mind. Poetry was possible. But I also, when I think about the things that influenced me early, I remember phrases like, "Do you mind? Do you mind?" And when I was 4 years old, I thought, well, yes, of course I mind my mother. But the person saying it was saying it in this tone that was irritated and they wanted me to move out of the way. Do you mind? So I think about those kinds of phrases that mean several different things possibly, and the way that language cleaves, even the word cleave, between two meanings, and in a way that's so much of what poetry is, this proliferation of possibility of meaning. But also, even in that early phrase that I puzzled over for so long, questions of voice and tone, and how that imparts meaning.
I'd love to know a little more about your grandfather, who was the poet that you mentioned.
Yes, so my great-grandfather was a Greek poet, very, very...
Name?
Angelos Sikelianos, very recognized in Greece. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize. He was very close friends with Nikos Kazantzakis. When I first traveled to Greece, I was constantly given gifts on behalf of my great-grandfather. Kilos of grapes to carry along, and amazing, amazing. It's changed somewhat, but he was a very revered poet. I was a little cut off from that lineage because it was my paternal lineage, and I didn't grow up with my father, so I had to rediscover that lineage.